For those of you who have been watching the Instagram evolution of this Tuesday Tips Live today, September 14th, you'll notice I am now wearing my glasses because I'm hoping that Instagram suspects that I am smarter because my glasses are on and it will not give us any more technical glitches. Hmm. We'll see. We'll see about that. In any event, welcome to Tuesday Tips Live. It's September 14th. We're in the middle of September, which is Personal Accountability Month, which is all about how can we take personal responsibility for our little piece of the world, our little piece of the planet, starting with ourselves. And so today we've got a perspective on it in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So the expert that is joining me today is Heather Sattler. Heather Sattler is the founder of Arusha Consulting. She's a professional diversity coach, and she works with organizations to do cultural trainings and coaching. She is fantastic and amazing. I am thrilled to be working with her myself, and I'm also thrilled to have her on the Instagram Live today. So she is going to be joining us shortly. We've been having some Instagram issues, like as noted, but that's cool. We're rolling with it because that is life. That is life in the big city. And hopefully Heather will be joining us here shortly. I started working with Heather because, last year, as many of us did, there were moments of, wow, where can I be doing things better in my life? What does it look like to do better when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion? So last year, I did all the things. I'm reading about John Lewis. I'm reading White Fragility. I'm reading How to Be an Anti-Racist. I'm reading all the things. I'm doing all the things. And ultimately, what I realized in working with Heather is that it's not about reading all of the things and consuming all of the things. It's actually about a deeper level of work. And I see that Heather has joined us now. Oh, and Tim is there. Hey, Tim, what's shaking? What's shaking, man? Let's see. Let's get Heather up here. Let's get Heather up here. Let's see if this works. I think this is going to work. I think this is going to work. Heather, I just invited you. Heather is joining. Arusha Consulting joined. I see it happening. Oh my goodness, miracle of all miracles. Heather, how are you?
I'm well, and I'm so grateful for everything about you, Melissa. Everything you do, especially patience and grace today as we figure this out.
Oh my gosh, who knew? Instagram is kind of funky, And word to the wise, everybody, this is Heather's first Instagram Live, and she is nailing it. We are so lucky that we've got her here today. So, okay, so Heather, I just introduced you a bit. Quick question. What drew you into working in the realm of diversity, equity, inclusion? What inspired you?
Quick question. I don't know if it's a quick answer, but I will attempt it. And I was drawn in, and it was the water I drank before it had a label. My parents raised me in the northwest side of Chicago, which was not very diverse, but they incorporated in ways. And I also realized all the opportunities they made possible for me were not possible for people around me necessarily. And so I became passionate about extending access to opportunity for all and studying all of the different ways that certain people get excluded. And that just became the path of my life.
I love it. I love it. I'm also a Northwest Sider. So that's one of the things that we have in common. One of the things that's interesting is when I started, and I think this might be a good place to kind of start, is when we started working together, one of the aha moments that I had was that I was part of the dominant culture. And that seems, now when I say that, some people might say, oh, of course you are. And some people might say, wait a minute, what do you mean by the dominant culture? So Heather, is that something that you could quickly just define for folks?
Yeah, so here in the United States, our dominant culture that a lot of us just take for granted as, the American way, if you will, it really has been formulated and unquestioned, led by, patriarchy slash men, Christian, Judeo-Christian, cisgender, typically married, middle class, white, straight people, and they're the ones who are making decisions and the laws and creating the structures all around us, whether it's in our workplace or in our communities or in our own families. And so that's the culture that we, the influence that we internalize, whether we acknowledge it or not.
Got it. That makes sense. That makes sense. And what is interesting is to notice that even when we are in the dominant culture or part of the dominant culture, there might be aspects of us, aspects of ourselves, or reasons why we might connect or relate or not feel like we are part of the dominant culture, which can kind of shift how we perceive other cultures that are not like ours. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think it's important to note here that all of us, we'd be hard pressed to find someone who isn't a member of at least one dominant in group. And so that is to say, anything that we talk about today can be shared and considered by anybody who's following you. I know you have over 1.3 thousand followers at least. And so I don't want anybody to feel like we're just focusing on one group here. And I just want to make sure that we're all kind of taking a moment to acknowledge the air that we breathe, that we just take for granted as the right way or the way, to realize what influence and how it affects us and how we make decisions, how we show up when we engage with others.
Right, right. And what I'm noticing is in my journey to be more inclusive and more equitable and actually pay attention to the impact that I'm having, it's not what I thought it would be. It's not the journey that I thought it would be. And so one of the questions that I have for you, you gave us a brief discussion or a brief definition of what the dominant culture is, and that it can be different in different scenarios. So when one is in a scenario where you're in part of the dominant culture, what are some of the challenges that we face when we are trying to be more inclusive and more equitable?
So I think there's two broad categories, and one of them is there's a lack of awareness on a lot of people's part. They really want to do the right thing. They think they're doing the right thing, and they have difficulty with the difference between intention and impact. And so that causes a lot of roadblocks along the way. And then the second thing is sometimes there's internal or external resistance. So the internal resistance is this idea that, yeah, I'm this white progressive liberal and I really want everybody to have the same opportunities, up until it becomes a question of me having to back, where I can't be as full of a person as I am, or I don't get certain, privileges. And I know that's a loaded word that we can talk about more if you like. So, to what extent do I really want to be part of this change? So that's the internal resistance. And then there's external resistance. And so people who really want to make change might come up against a friend group who are not as far along on the journey and who won't have it, if you will. And so people tamp down what they really want to do and who they really want to be. And then that also obviously causes a lot of roadblocks. And, that's friend groups, everybody has them, in the workplace, depending on, if it's your executive level people who are showing this resistance and you feel like there's nothing else you can do, or, other ways that we want to show up that those around us, it wouldn't be politically safe to do so. That's a big roadblock.
Interesting. Interesting. Well, and it's when I think about resistance that I've experienced, it's sort of being in this realm of not knowing exactly what to do sometimes, like being in scenarios where I feel like, okay, how do I interact here and do it in a way that is compassionate and with empathy, and so that you mentioned the difference between intention and impact, and so being concerned about having an unconscious impact, right? Like, oh, my intention is XYZ, and my impact is I'm actually creating a negative impact when I don't necessarily realize that. Um, are there ways to kind of check that differential between our intentions and our impact?
Absolutely. So the reason this comes up is because we are unfamiliar. We have lack of experience. We have lack of opportunity to be immersed with people who are different from us. And so the single best thing that we can do is be intentional about our learning, our immersion, and most important, our reflection on those two things. So I think a lot of us started like diving into these lists of books, and podcasts, and things like that came out after the murder of George Floyd, and those are great. Resources are so important. There's a lot of great stuff out there, but it kind of became the diversity Olympics, right? Like, or the woke Olympics, who read the most stuff. And if you haven't read this yet, then you're really not up to date and things like that. But what was missing was that intentionality of reflecting on how does that show up for me and the ways that I engage with others. And so I think, taking that pause and really noticing that is really important. And I know I had another thread that I wanted to follow. Remind me the original question.
The original question was closing that gap between our intentions and our impact.
Yeah. So watch the feedback. We get feedback all subtle and otherwise. And so if somebody does bring up something that, they noted that there was probably a gap in your intention and your impact, because most of us don't go into conversations and experiences wanting to cause harm. Think about the fact that that person took the time to take the risk to show that to us. And then rule number one, do not be defensive. Do not try to explain, oh, I didn't mean to do that. Oh my gosh, and I just listened to that podcast and I knew that was the wrong thing to do, and then here I go doing it. Like, that explanation, it's unnecessary. It doesn't lead to the solution. So instead, listen to the feedback, ask questions about, how did that make you feel? When else might have I done something? Thank them for coming forward, and then spend some time on your own thinking about the data that you're getting from people and things that you're learning outside, and if there's a disconnect, and follow up with the person who let you in on, this little blind spot that you have that causes big, issues potentially.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. For those of you who are just joining us, I'm here with Heather Sattler, diversity, equity, inclusion coach and founder of Arusha Consulting. We're talking about the difference between our intentions and our impact, and how to handle those situations when maybe there was a flub or a faux pas. I think when I look at it from an emotional intelligence standpoint and from a cultural standpoint, sometimes I know this desire to try to get things right, and then feeling shame if we don't get it right, and that kind of being a burden to actually growing, because then you won't, if you're in that position, one might jump. I could feel that in myself. Wow, I would feel so bad that I potentially did harm. I would feel so bad about potentially doing harm that I would want to try to explain it. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, right? Instead of just pausing, thanking somebody, listening, asking to go deeper if they're willing to go deeper, and to just use that as a powerful moment instead of latching on to trying to get it right or feeling ashamed at getting it wrong. Do you notice that with your clients? How do you help them deal with that aspect?
Well, first I help them understand that no one's perfect. And especially in this arena where there are so many different preferences about the language that we use when it comes to differences. And so, we're not always going to get it right. A good rule of thumb is, of course, to ask questions. What are your preferred pronouns? How do you prefer that I, acknowledge that you're, Hispanic, Latinx, Mexican? Another good rule of thumb is if you know how specifically that you report on that. But some people don't even want that. Able-bodied community, hearing community, non-hearing community, they all have different language they prefer. So we're going to get it wrong at some point or other. And so when I work with clients, I reference what we just talked about, which is really the subtle acts of exclusion accountability system. And so that's one of the resources that I'd love to share with your audience here. It's a book that's written by Dr. Tiffany Banna and Dr. Michael Barron. And they've put together this great framework to help, they underline that you need to build trusting relationships in the first place, but then also what to do when we don't get it right, when we step in it, and how we can, in good faith, have these conversations move forward. And so I really like their framework. I else that they provide, which is acknowledgement of 8 different ways that we sometimes step in it without realizing it, and certainly without intending. And so it's really cool to boil it down into just 8 things to remember that we might possibly, for example, be making someone feel like they're not vigilant, or they're a curiosity or a burden, and then the 5 other, categories in the taxonomy. So I go over that with clients, and that's been really helpful, because so often it's actually us trying to bond with somebody and build community and give a compliment, that we err in the wrong direction. And so I find their resources very helpful.
Oh, I love that. I love that. And everybody, I will post these resources in the comments below so that we have access to them. And as we're going through, if you have a question or a comment, feel free to pop the comment or the question into the chat, and we will handle that. So, okay, so that's a great resource that people can use. What are some simple things that we can either do, or simple questions that we can ask ourselves to really incorporate these ideas into our daily life? Because it feels like, we want to make our culture better and change things for the better, and it sometimes can feel overwhelming. So I'm wondering, what are some simple ways we can just bring it into our daily life?
I love that question where you specifically say, what questions can we ask ourselves? Because as coaches, we know the powerful, brilliant expertise. And so one of the questions that I love, and that shows up in all different kinds of ways in this arena, is what else might be true? And so, yeah. And so, what are you acknowledging there?
Yeah, because what I love about what else might be true is it doesn't make anything false.
Right.
Like there are multiple truths.
So, for example, I have a client, he's a male, and he supervises a female in a very male dominated industry. And so when he came to me, because there have been reports that there was, some exclusionary behavior happening, he was explaining to me, we never really hit it off because she was always competing with me. We have this culture here where we're all team motivated, we share victories, and, we don't really brag or put our work forward unless it's from the team perspective. And she just kept doing that. And the more he told me about it, I validated that she was violating some of her values and the values that this organization and his unit have in teamwork and collaboration and shared victories and all of those things that are really wonderful. However, when I invited him to think about it from her perspective, about how the rooms that she has sat in and being a part of a male dominated industry, did she think she was competing by speaking up and showing her work or raising her hand more often than everybody else did? Or was something else at play? What else might have been true? And so he was able to get to the point oh my God, I never thought of that before. People used to yada, yada, yada her, and that's what she was used to. And so she had to find a way to get above that noise and to be noticed and taken seriously.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. Okay, if that question is that great, what's another great question? Now I want another one.
Okay. A really important question for those of us who do have that hesitance that you mentioned is, what keeps me from speaking up? So if we can go through our days and realize moments that passed that we didn't do the thing we wanted to do, it's not about beating ourselves up and feeling a ton of blame for it, though there is urgency behind this and we want to get better at it. The way that we get better at it is, what was it in that moment that stopped me from speaking up? And the more you can get to those root causes and work through those and ask what else might be true, instead of telling a story about what will happen when we open our mouth, then that's, finding those answers will be very helpful.
I love that. And that question, what keeps me from speaking up? It would not surprise me if for many people it's the fear of getting it wrong or the fear of doing harm. And so if we can acknowledge the fact that we will not always get it right, and we acknowledge the fact that we may unintentionally do harm, even when we're doing our very best, if we acknowledge that from the get-go and are okay with messing up and are okay with stepping in it a bit, and willing to clean it up and willing to have that growth happen, then there's more permission. I feel like there's more permission there. And I feel like we have to have that inner dialogue with ourselves and have that sort of inner support before we are going to do something that might feel like a risk, so that we can risk more often and take a stand more often and speak up more often, right?
Absolutely.
Does that make sense?
Yes, there's that risk of doing that thing. And then again, that risk of offending somebody else. And we have to get over that. I don't like either or thinking, if I support this community, then I'm not supporting that community. And there are people around us who hold us to that. We have to get over that. And so by asking that question in that, in the specific moments that it's happening to play out for this individual, what did it mean to them? And how did I think they were going to react? So why did I silence myself? We get answers that help us be able to build the relationships that can accept both.
Well, yeah, and I suppose this is one of those times where when we are doing this inner work, we can look within our own circle, we can look within our own community of people that may be willing to have more difficult conversations with, instead of like immediately in my head I think, oh, I'm going to have that tough conversation with that relative, and I know that we have different points of view on this, and I've been waiting to kind of like have this intense confrontation with them. That's probably not the first conversation to have.
You just led to my third question, and we didn't before. We did not talk about these questions.
No, what's the third question?
Question is, how well do I call people in instead of calling them out?
How do I call people in instead of calling them out?
Yeah, how good am I at that? How did I do today? For those of us who have gotten over that hesitancy and we're able to speak up, I see it on social media a lot. I don't see it in real life experiences too much because everybody knows what I do. But you see on social media, like, your racist is showing, or put away your misogyny, or like we just attack what people are saying, where that's definitely calling them out. How can we call them in instead to help them come along with us, knowing that we all make mistakes and that we all need that feedback that is constructive to help us internalize what we did, learn the facts, and do better next time?
Yeah. Yeah, I thought about it. There were some things in the news about a particular alderman that you might recall recently, and in my head, I thought, wow, like I want to send an email, I want to blast him and like call him out, right? And in my head, I heard myself say that word, call him out, and I know the phrase call him in. I did not want to call him in. I did not. In my head, there are often times I think to myself, and this is just me being fully authentic, that you should know better by now, and shame on you. And I thought, okay, even still, how do I want to show up? So then I have this idea. I want to throw this idea out at you. I was thinking about getting postcards and just kind of straight up postcards. And if it has things to do with, the Chicagoland area, maybe it has like the Chicago flag on it, whatever. And just writing on the postcard very simply, you can do better. And like sending it to people. Because I thought, wow, I want to be reminded that I can do better, because sometimes I forget that I can do better, right? So that would be a way to kind of try to call people forth. And it's a short enough phrase. And it's not just calling people forth, but it's also holding them accountable. Like, hey, you can do better. It's both you can do better, and it's also you can do better. It's both at the same time.
You're exactly right. And there's a time and a place for calling people in and calling people out. So when we're talking about those who lack familiarity, experience, gap between their intention and their impact, they really were well-meaning. You need to call people in. But when it's something that's harassment or that affects the way that you're referencing, and maybe you can put a link to an article so people know what we're talking about, it ended up affecting the way that people were serviced in the ward. That you need to call somebody out and say you need better. So that's really good.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a time and a place. Alex will be happy to know that because she can relate to it. So there's a time and a place. And I suppose, once again, inserting this pause, I feel like so many of the problems that we have today can be solved just by pausing. And if we pause and think, what's behind me wanting to call somebody out? If it's an emotion like anger, okay, well, I need to just slow my roll and chill for a second before I actually react or send a comment. If it's because of, like you said, results that are happening that are impacting others, where others are being harmed or not being serviced, an area is not being surfaced properly, then it's a time to call people out. I also wonder if you've attempted to call somebody in several times where it could be a personal relationship at a certain point, and you called somebody in, like, at what can you say, okay, I've done my best to call you in and call you in. I have to call you out now.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable, especially because it's the death by paper cut, the small, subtle acts of exclusion that add up to real harm and that allow for our culture to keep rolling the way that it is. And so there's where it's crossed over something unintentional to something that, when unchecked and unaddressed, is no longer unintentional.
Right, right, right. Because they already have the information, and they're no longer acting. They're no longer in that you can't give them that pass anymore because they know. So what do you think? Okay, so first of all, anybody out there, if you have questions, feel free to type them in. Also, I'm going to note, if you're watching this after the fact and you are triggered or inspired or whatever, leave a comment, leave a question, and we can reply to it after the fact, even when the Instagram live is no longer live. So we can definitely reply and respond to questions. So for someone who is looking to do better and starting to ask the questions, are there actually any actions that they can take as well as the inquiries that they're doing for themselves?
Yes, that intentional learning and immersion. So on top of the reflection, and those were just some powerful questions that we can ask when we're reflecting. But certainly any time that we are looking at a new resource, and it takes a little consideration to decide where to focus. So we have culture specific resources out there and we have culture general resources out there. And so I really like my culture general resources like subtle acts of inclusion that you can apply universally and get kind of a leg up and some in the way that you communicate with others. And also, depending on who you are and who you're engaging with the most, it's really important to study culture specific things. And so for me, recently, over the past several years, it's definitely been about race. I mean, I just see the urgency behind this and what has happened, and gaining a greater understanding about how it continues to happen in ways that we don't even recognize. And so I've been spending a lot of reading, listening to podcasts, watching movies, and then also just immersing myself in culture that is present that doesn't carry the mantle of like racism or classism or any other ism, but it's a portrait of Black Americans so that I can understand better what life is like for any perspective instead of just kind of being siloed into this, white media that we consume. And so that has to do with like who we follow on social media and who we read and just for news and things like that. And I have, to this end, I put together a website, website. I put together a crowdsourced database where anybody can contribute a resource that has helped them. And it has to do with any dimension of diversity. It's highly searchable, and I really like it because whoever puts a resource up there has to say why it's helpful to them. So it helps distinguish from things that kind of go into a rabbit hole with all different resources and not know where to spend our time. But the important thing is to pick things that help answer questions that we have, help enrich our lives, and reflect on them before consuming more and more and more. The other thing I want to say about immersion is not everybody has access out with people who are different from them. Those of us in cosmopolitan areas did for a very long time, and then COVID struck, and so that made it really difficult. So find other ways to make that immersion happen. And when approaching an opportunity for immersion, maybe with an existing friend or colleague or somebody that tread lightly, because I'm sure most everybody who's listening to this has heard the warning about asking people to do the work for us when they are the ones who are already not benefiting, being harmed by the system and the practices at play. And so these conversations have to do with asking permission and asking where they are and inviting them in for the reasons that you authentically want to have the conversation. If you're just checking something off a list, they'll see right through that. If there's some genuine curiosity there and a goal that you have for doing better, then they're much more likely to want to engage with you.
That makes sense. That makes sense. There was so much in what you just said there. One of the things that is that stands out is just the different levels that we're talking about. So cultural, like in general, the cultural that there is a cultural general that handles any type of cultural difference. Right? It could even be rural, urban. It could be like, it doesn't necessarily have to do with, there are so many identities that we carry with ourselves, within ourselves. And sometimes those identities are not even necessarily visible identities, you know? So that's interesting. So I love looking at it from a cultural general to cultural specific, where it's impacting you the most, and then getting really granular in terms of the people that are in your life and how to have those interactions, and to do so with care and as part of, right? I think that has been a big lesson for me, at least over the past year and a half. Like, I will do the immersion and I've been doing the immersion and the learning, and I was processing it for sure. But the processing was happening much more intellectually, as opposed to looking at, wow, wait a minute, what's this framework that I have? I understand why I might be missing something here. And I understand why my intention and my impact, why there might be a gap there. And it's really helpful, but that's internal work that nobody can do except for me, myself, and my heart, right? And
exactly. Are you,
that's
your framework, talking about the IDI framework?
Yeah, well, I was talking about the IDI, but some of the things that came, so that's a good we should talk about that. So there's an assessment called the IDI that Heather is certified in and works with, that is really powerful because of the verbiage and the terminology and how it looks at how you deal with different identities and cultures. Can you give us just sort of like a blurb about it, a quick blurb?
Yeah, I think the framework that's so important that we didn't talk about yet, and I think this is what you were referencing, is the IDI invites you to look at the the way that you show up, the way that you hold your values so closely, engage with others, communicate, make decisions, all of those things, before you start learning about other cultures and judging them, because we're kind of on auto perceive based on those cultural influences. Again, whether or not we acknowledge that we're part of a culture. And so it has to slow down and look at that. And so you said, you noticed why you were missing some things before, that you didn't see the gap. And so once we do that, we become even more skilled at being able to, really walk in somebody else's shoes and see what their cultural influences were and why they're showing up the way that they are, to honor the values that they have before we start judging from our set of values.
Yeah, which is so helpful, because it's sort of, it's kind of noticing what lens is on the camera. Like what lenses am I wearing today? Oh, today I'm wearing my progressives. So I know I know not to expect to see everything close up depending on where I'm looking. Like, I know what lenses are in. And so when we know that, then it makes it easier to filter and understand what we're doing and what we're perceiving.
Exactly. The other thing that the IDI gives us is the gift of understanding that this is a competence, right? We are where we are based on that familiarity and intentional work that we've done in the past. And now we can say, okay, no shame where we are now. Where do we want to get, and what will we do to get there, and how will we stay accountable to that? And
Yes.
the gift is to kind of take that blame and shame out of there. And that's, again, this work is so urgent and important. And there's this phrase that's going around, and I can't attribute it to the correct author right now, but it's like, this work is very urgent. Let us slow down. We want to do it right. It's that important.
Yeah. Heather, I so appreciate the conversation today and the thoughtfulness and the resources. I am going to put links in the comments below especially the link about the subtle acts of inclusion. I think that is going to be, in terms of having a cultural general reference for people, I think that's going to be really helpful. And I love the crowdsourced list of resources with the whys behind it, so that we can look at things through that perspective. Is there any one last thing that you'd like to share before we go?
Please do check out that database because we have not been able to update it. As you might have could tell when I was joining the Instagram, uh, we are not very technological savvy at the moment. And so we are missing our key person, which we will fill in a little bit. But the whole idea of it is that everybody would be contributing to it, not just Arusha. And so what's important to you is going to be important to others, and it can help us keep up to date. We've been so busy doing the actual work and loving every minute of accompanying people with this work that we can amp up our resource database, and we can also amp up our Insta presence and other things. So I thank you, Melissa, for inviting me to come be a part of this and have something to post. And I look forward to expanding our presence, influencing people in other ways than just the day-to-day work.
Excellent. I so appreciate you, Heather, and the work that you're doing and the questions that you ask. I love leaving people with questions. So can we go through those 3 questions one more time?
Sure. The first question, my favorite question, is what else might be true?
What else might be true? Okay.
The second question is what keeps me from speaking up? And the third one is how well am I doing at calling people in rather than calling them out?
I love good questions. I love good questions because that's really what it's all about, is asking the questions so that then when we take the actions, we're in alignment and we can have a more intentional impact, and in the intention impacting in the way that we want instead of the unconscious impact and the stepping in it. And I just love the grace that you share with what to do when you step in it, because acknowledging we're all going to step in it at some point in some room, someplace, and to just be present with it and be with it and move through it. It's fantastic. So thank you. Thank you, everybody who joined us. If you joined in late and you weren't able to hear some of the rest of the conversation, I'm going to be posting this. Feel free to comment, share resources, share feedback, ask questions, and we will respond in kind. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your Tuesday.
Bye-bye.
I'm going to sign off. Bye. Oh, and also stay tuned for more personal accountability to come in September. Next week, I'm going to have Allison Miller on, and so that will be interesting. But we'll have different experts on throughout the month of September and then throughout the rest of the year. So if you have any suggestions of people to have on the Tuesday Tips calls, please suggest them, and I'd love to have conversations with them. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.